Hello, everyone. In this episode, we're stepping back into a single week in America. From Monday, April 15th, 1912, through Sunday morning, April 21st. These were the days when newspapers across the country were scrambling to keep up with breaking news, printing front pages built on fragments, rushed dispatches, corrections, and contradictions, all unfolding hour by hour. This story isn't told with hindsight. It's told the way Americans experienced it then. Through front pages, bold headlines, and early reports that were often incomplete, emotional, and uncertain. What you're about to hear isn't a complete record of everything that happened that week. Instead, it's a focused look at the news most people would have encountered first. The headlines delivered to doorsteps, shouted from newsstands, and read on street corners. We're staying with the front page, where the news arrived fastest, loudest, and often least complete. We'll move through the week the way the papers did, letting the story speak for itself as it unfolded, unfinished, evolving, and very much alive. Now imagine this. It is Monday morning in the United States. April 15th, 1912. Across the country, newspapers arrive the same way they always do. Folded, stacked, bundled, tossed onto porches, sold on corners, handed across counters. There is nothing to suggest that this Monday is different from any other. Readers open their papers expecting the familiar: politics, local crime, business notices, transportation schedules, sports items, advertisements promising safety, stability, and prosperity. In places like Columbia, Tennessee, the front page reflects that steady rhythm. County politics, reform efforts, election organizing, delegates named, factory inspections, plans for public buildings, a long-discussed high school project promoted as civic progress. Crime appears briefly. An old offender apprehended, reported without alarm. Human interest items dot the page. Visitors arriving, meetings scheduled, committees formed. Life as usual continues in print. There is no sense of interruption yet. Elsewhere, the same pattern holds. In Honolulu, the evening bulletin opens with national politics. Headlines focus on President Taft, party maneuvering, convention resolutions, and delegate counts. The tone is confident, declarative. This is presented as the central business of the day. Transportation accidents are reported, but on land. Train wrecks appear in lower columns. Loss of life is noted. Causes are not yet known. The coverage is brief and factual, treated as serious but familiar. Only later in the day does something new begin to appear. A wire report mentions that a great steamship has encountered ice. The ship is identified as the Titanic, repeatedly described as the largest steamship ever built. The emphasis appearing before names, before numbers, before any sense of consequence. The wording is cautious. The damage is referred to as a gash. The ship is said to be disabled, but afloat. Nearby vessels are reported to be assisting. One phrase appears again and again across editions. All passengers safe. There are no figures, no lists of names, no mention of lifeboats or evacuation. The story does not dominate the page. It sits beneath political headlines and alongside advertisements. It is presented as an incident involving a remarkable ship, not a disaster. Later editions repeat the same information. The language remains reassuring. The situation appears contained, the ship damaged, but the people saved. By the end of Monday, the newspapers present a clear picture, at least on the surface. According to the reports available, The largest ship in the world has been injured, not lost. Those aboard have been rescued. The danger appears to have passed. The press is slow. The day ends. Monday closes without panic, without mourning, and without the sense that the story is unfinished. For many readers across the country, April 15th ends as it began, ordinary, orderly, and unaware. Tuesday, April 16th, 1912. In Kansas, the Topeka State Journal leads not with certainty, but with admission. Do not know awful truth. The subhead explains that even survivors aboard the rescue ship do not yet fully understand what has happened. Another headline follows: Wireless operators pay no attention to inquiries. The implication is not indifference, but overload. Too many questions, too few answers. By mid-morning, newspapers in the Northeast begin issuing extras. Information arriving over the wires is contradictory. One dispatch claims all passengers are safe. Another claims many lives are feared lost. A third reports that no official word has yet been received. Some papers print multiple versions side by side. The public reads, rereads, and waits. In these early hours, the disaster has not yet taken its final shape. It is still possible, at least in print, that this story will end with damage rather than death. That possibility does not last long. By Tuesday afternoon, the language hardens. In New Haven, Connecticut, an extra edition is rushed to print. The headline does not hedge. 1,410 lives are lost. There is no question mark. Beneath it, another line follows. 866 survivors on Carpathia. Other liners, they're too late. The numbers are printed as fact, even though they will later change. At this moment, the paper treats them as settled. The article lists the names of the prominent dead first. John Jacob Astor is reported lost. His wife is reported saved. The contrast is stark and immediate. Below the main headline, smaller stories radiate outward. He was on the Titanic. Parents of dead student on Titanic. Crowds wild with grief. The disaster has already begun to localize itself. Readers are invited to scan the page for familiar names, familiar families, familiar towns. Yet even on this extraordinary extra, the rest of the world has not disappeared. One brief item reports a woman struck and killed by a train in East Haven. There is no investigation described, no wider cause suggested. It is printed and then left behind as a local tragedy. Local politics appears in short notices. Advertisements still occupy space at the bottom of the page. Life, even here, continues to compete for attention. Across the country, Tuesday's papers arrive with a new tone. The first shock has passed for some. What follows is uncertainty. Elsewhere, newspapers begin printing diagrams. One widely circulated image places the Titanic beside an iceberg, carefully labeled with measurements: height above water, depth below, the length of the vessel. These diagrams attempt to explain the disaster mechanically, not emotionally. How big was the ship? How large was the ice? How could the two have met? At this stage, newspapers are still searching for explanation, not blame. On Tuesday, survivor accounts begin to appear, but sparingly. The papers describe them as sorrowing survivors, not accusers. Their statements are brief. They speak of confusion, of darkness, of ice visible in the distance. Some mention music. One phrase appears again and again, without commentary: nearer, my God, to thee. Some papers do not explain why this matters, assuming readers already understand. Other sources report that the band played the hymn, or that sacred music was heard as the ship went down. Not all survivors agree. Even as Titanic fills columns, it does not fully erase the rest of the front page. In Minnesota, the Virginia Enterprise runs a paper with no Titanic banner at all. Instead, the front page features banking advertisements promising stability, optimistic reports on mining development, city officials resigning in the interest of harmony, insurance policies printed prominently, and beer promotions in bold type. Interest rates appear in large print, 3% interest paid. The message is not explicit, but unmistakable. Here, normal life continues. This contrast appears across the country. Some cities are consumed by Titanic. Others acknowledge it, and then move on. Tuesday's papers also carry reports of other disasters. Train wrecks appear alongside Titanic headlines, competing for space on crowded front pages. One headline announces a fast train involved in a terrible wreck. Another reports that 12 people have lost their lives. The details are fewer. The coverage is shorter. But the language is familiar. Words like wrecked, terrible, and fast signal a public safety event. Derailment or collision, multiple casualties, a cause still unknown or under investigation. This is not a solitary loss, but a collective one, printed beside the ocean tragedy and folded into the day's news. Floods and levee failures are mentioned briefly, often without photographs. These stories are smaller, but not hidden. They remind readers that danger is not confined to the ocean. Political news continues. Presidential activity appears in short items. Messages are sent. Cables go unanswered. Official responses are recorded without flourish. Congress continues its routine. Even as uncertainty dominates the headlines, the financial machinery of the nation continues to move. For now, governance continues in parallel. By late Tuesday afternoon, few papers still suggest the Titanic might have survived. The ship is now described plainly as sunk, but the circumstances remain unsettled. Did she strike the iceberg at speed? Was fog involved? Were warnings ignored? The papers do not answer these questions. They print them. As the day continues, more extras appear. Information over the wires remains contradictory. Some reports still insist passengers were saved. Others fear even greater loss. Some admit openly that no official word has yet been received. The public reads, rereads, and waits. By Tuesday night, newsboys are shouting headlines in the streets, and America reacts in real time. Some shout numbers. Others shout names. Some shout only one word: Titanic. Inside the papers, the same facts appear again and again, sometimes slightly altered, sometimes entirely reshaped. Passenger counts differ by hundreds. Some papers report 705 saved. Others insist 800 survived. Another claims 866 are alive. The source of the confusion is not hidden. The reports are coming by wireless. They are fragmentary. They are delayed. They are sometimes secondhand. Several papers note openly that wireless operators are overwhelmed, unable to respond to the flood of inquiries pouring in from newsrooms, shipping offices, and anxious families. Messages arrive out of order. Some go unanswered entirely. Silence itself becomes part of the story. And when the presses turn again, the tone has shifted. By the end of April 16th, 1912, Americans know something enormous has happened. They do not yet know how many are dead. They do not know who is responsible. They do not know whether it could have been avoided. They do not know what comes next. They only know the story is not finished. And as Tuesday's papers are folded and set aside, presses across the country begin preparing for Wednesday. Because this week is only beginning. Wednesday, April 17th, 1912. From disaster to inquiry. By Wednesday morning, the shock that defined the start of the week begins to harden into something else. Newspapers no longer ask whether the Titanic is lost. They ask how. They ask why. And they ask who knew what and when. Even now, nothing is settled. The numbers remain unstable. The stories still conflict. And the language of judgment has not yet fully arrived. Wednesday's newspapers arrive heavier, literally. More columns, more names, more diagrams, more testimony. In North Dakota, the Bismarck Daily Tribune places mourning language directly into its headline. Titanic tomb contains bodies of 1,595 people in its deep-sea grave. The ship is no longer described as wreckage. It is a tomb. Nearby, another headline reads, "Sorrowing survivors tell terrible tales." Survivors are no longer anonymous figures on a rescue ship. They are witnesses. In the earliest days after the sinking, newspapers repeatedly printed claims that there had been no panic, no rushing crowds, no screaming. These assurances came most clearly from officials, from White Star Line statements, and from J. Bruce Ismay himself. Some survivors echoed the same claims, describing only what they personally had seen. At this stage, papers did not yet separate individual experience from collective reality. Observation was treated as conclusion. By midweek, however, another name begins to compete with the ship itself. J. Bruce Ismay. He is not dead. He is not missing. He is present. And the newspapers do not quite know what to do with that. The Washington Herald declares, "Senate committee hold J. Bruce Ismay. Director is held. Cannot leave U.S." The paper does not ask whether he should be questioned. It assumes it. From Bridgeport comes another framing. Ismay, who escaped with women, tells U.S. investigators strange tale of what he didn't observe. That phrase, "didn't observe," begins to recur. He did not see panic. He did not see confusion. He did not see the lifeboats filled. He did not see the end. One paper describes him as having cut a pitiful figure. Another reports, "Quivers under lash of Senator Smith." This is no longer only a disaster story. It has become a judgment story. And it unfolds headline by headline, day after day. At the same time, Halifax emerges as a focal point in the papers, not because survivors have arrived, but because hope has not yet fully receded. Wireless dispatches pass through the port, naming steamers believed to be moving toward the wreck site. The Virginia, the Parisian. Their names appear in cables and headlines as possible bearers of news, or of people still alive. Particular attention is given to the Parisian, reported to be heading toward Philadelphia. Newspapers explain why this mattered. If the ship had taken aboard even a small number of passengers, their arrival would mean the story was not yet finished. For readers scanning the columns, direction matters as much as speed. East or west, rescue or return. Wireless communication fuels both hope and confusion. Some reports describe ships cruising near the scene, exchanging messages, searching for life. Others state that vessels have already abandoned hope of rescue. The contradiction is not resolved. It sits side by side, in print. The ocean is full of ships and empty of certainty. A Halifax dispatch reports that the cable ship Minia has sighted wreckage at sea. The detail is stark. Debris is visible, but no boats, no bodies, no signs of life. This does not end the search, but it changes its tone. The language shifts quietly from rescue to recovery. The wreck is now given coordinates: latitude 41.16 north, longitude 50.14 west. Cold numbers on the page, carrying enormous weight. With the position fixed, calculations follow. Loss is estimated at more than $2 million, a figure printed beside names of the missing, converting human absence into measurable cost. Lists of the unaccounted expand. Major Archibald Butt is named among the missing. John Jacob Astor appears repeatedly. J.B. Taylor, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, is also listed. These names arrive without stories, only silence, which becomes news itself. At the same time, papers announce that certain women are safe. Mrs. Astor is listed among the survivors, along with Mrs. Elios Schross and Mrs. Jacques Fratel. The pattern is noticeable. Survival is announced briefly. Loss stretches across columns. By midweek, papers also begin shaping the story of Captain Edward J. Smith. The language surrounding him shifts noticeably. He is described as calm, experienced, steady. One paper states plainly that Captain Smith avoided panic and died. There is no suggestion yet of error. No accusation, no speculation about judgment. Instead, Captain Smith is framed as a figure of discipline and composure, standing at his post as the ship went down. This portrayal appears before official inquiry testimony is widely printed. It matters. For now, the captain is a symbol of order in catastrophe. Wednesday's papers also begin carrying articles that focus not on the sinking itself, but on conditions at sea. Several discuss speed in fog or ice, framed as a general maritime concern rather than a specific failure. One statement, attributed to Cowles, appears as opinion rather than fact. The article suggests reduced speed in fog, but does not assert that Titanic violated any operational rule. That distinction is important. At this point in the week, no official fault is assigned, no operational orders are cited, no specific command decisions are confirmed. The debate exists, but it remains abstract. The Titanic is not yet singled out as reckless, only as tragic. By Wednesday afternoon, new names appear in the papers, not passengers, ships. Several newspapers report that German steamers were in the vicinity on the night of the disaster. One vessel appears repeatedly, the Frankfurt. Some reports state it was 20 miles closer than the Carpathia. Others emphasize that outside assistance was declined. The phrasing is careful. The papers do not say help was refused after the sinking. They say communication occurred before the final outcome was fully known. In some versions, the Titanic is reported to have signaled a German steamer to keep clear. Again, no accusation is attached, only sequence. These details complicate the story. They suggest proximity. They suggest missed opportunity. They suggest uncertainty at sea. But the papers do not resolve the contradiction. They print it, and they move on. By Thursday, April 18th, the story shifts again. this time from the ocean to Washington. Across the country, newspapers make it clear that the disaster has entered a new phase. The Washington Herald leads with government action, announcing that the Senate has moved to intervene. The headline is precise in its wording. Senate committee holds J. Bruce Ismay. Ismay is not arrested. He is not accused. He is held, prevented from leaving the country as the inquiry begins. Sub-headlines explain what this means. 16 crew members are subpoenaed. White Star Line officials are questioned. Testimony is expected immediately. The tragedy has now entered the machinery of the state. As testimony begins to appear in the papers, J. Bruce Ismay's own account is printed prominently. Some typesetters render his name oddly. Some readers misread it. But the message itself is clear. Ismay insists that he issued no reckless orders, that he observed nothing improper, that he gave no command affecting speed or navigation. In multiple papers, his denial is summarized plainly. One article emphasizes what he claims not to have seen. No panic, no disorder, no danger apparent. At this point in the week, Ismay is not yet a villain in print. He is a witness. The papers do not endorse his claims, but they do not reject them either. They record his words. Judgment, if it is coming, has not yet arrived. Thursday's coverage also turns toward the White Star Line itself. Company officials are described as nervous, guarded, careful in their answers. One paper notes that executives are undergoing questioning while still attempting to maintain normal operations. There is no formal charge yet, but there is scrutiny. Another figure enters the story on Thursday, the captain of the Carpathia. He is placed on the stand to testify about the rescue operation, the condition of survivors, and the timing of wireless messages. His testimony is framed as factual, not emotional. He describes what he found, not what he believes. The Carpathia itself is now portrayed as a moving vessel of testimony, carrying not just survivors, but evidence. At the same time, the front pages remind readers that the nation has not stopped. Even as the Senate convenes, other crises compete for space. President William Howard Taft issues an urgent appeal for aid to victims of catastrophic flooding along the Mississippi River. More than 25,000 people are reported homeless. Conditions are described as severe. Disease is feared. The federal government calls on citizens to contribute to relief efforts. Elsewhere, a major fire sweeps through Logan, Utah, destroying what is described as one of the city's finest commercial blocks. Losses are estimated at $100,000. The cause of the blaze remains unknown. Insurance figures are listed. Explanations are not. Another development draws attention to power and influence behind the scenes. Newspapers name J.P. Morgan Jr. in connection with the Titanic, reporting accusations that White Star Line officials may have withheld or suppressed information. Even at this early stage, the press is beginning to question whether wealth and corporate authority shaped how the disaster was explained and what the public was allowed to know. Human interest stories continue as well. One front-page feature highlights a survivor described as a moving picture bride. She is identified as Mrs. Daniel W. Marvin, formerly Mary G. Pugh, a young woman recently married and connected to the motion picture world. Her survival is framed as remarkable, a figure of modern glamour emerging from an event defined by loss. Her name is printed, her image displayed, her story offered as a counterpoint to the mounting death toll. By Thursday night, April 18th, the Titanic story is no longer only about a ship that sank. It has become a story about responsibility, about communication, about authority, about decision-making. The initial shock has settled into process. As the presses roll again, newspapers begin preparing readers for what comes next. For Friday, when survivors are expected to arrive, testimony will deepen and judgment will begin to inch closer. At this point in the week, it's important to pause for clarity. Thursday's newspapers are not yet describing events unfolding on land. They are reporting decisions, orders, and intentions set in motion before the Carpathia has arrived. Wireless messages have carried names, numbers, and fragments of testimony faster than the ship itself can travel. By the time the Carpathia reaches New York, much of the official response will already be underway. Shaped not by eyewitness arrival, but by information transmitted across the ocean, line by line, through the air. Friday, April 19th. By Friday morning, April 19th, the nation is no longer waking up to shock. It is waking up to consequence. The disaster has moved from breaking news into a long, unfolding reckoning. And even now, certainty remains elusive. The Friday's papers, attention begins to stretch outward again. Alongside continued reporting on inquiry and responsibility for the Titanic disaster, local and municipal concerns reassert themselves. One headline from Lima demands protection for a theatrical and pursuit wheel, a reminder that labor disputes, public amusements, and city regulation did not pause for tragedy. The item is practical, specific, and local, printed in the same papers that only days earlier were consumed entirely by loss at sea. The Carpathia approaches. Friday's coverage centers on movement. The Carpathia is nearing New York. Headlines announce the approach with anticipation tempered by restraint. Survivors on deck of rescue ship Carpathia. The language is careful. The ship is not yet docked. The survivors are not yet ashore. Their voices remain filtered through officers, cables, and officials. Papers describe crowds forming along the waterfront. Families arrive early. Names are scanned again and again. Long columns of survivors' names, incomplete, provisional, subject to correction, fill the pages. Readers trace fingers down the lists, hoping to find a familiar line. For some, the search ends quickly. For others, it does not end at all. As the Carpathia draws closer, testimony printed in the papers grows more detailed. The captain of the Carpathia, already quoted earlier in the week, continues to be cited. He describes receiving the distress signal, altering course immediately, and navigating ice to reach the scene. His testimony emphasizes speed of response rather than proximity. That distinction matters. By Friday, proximity has become a quiet undercurrent in the coverage. The German steamer Frankfurt continues to appear in articles examining which ships were nearby. Some reports state it was closer than the Carpathia. Others emphasize that assistance was declined before the situation was fully understood. The papers do not resolve the contradiction. They print it again. Several articles revisit the question of outside help, repeating that assistance was declined, but always with careful attention to timing. The wording is precise. The assistance is described as declined before the final outcome was known. This framing avoids labeling the decision as reckless. Instead, it is presented as action taken under uncertainty. By Friday, J. Bruce Ismay remains in the United States. The Senate inquiry continues. His earlier assertions that he saw no panic, issued no improper orders, and observed nothing reckless still appear in print, but now in a broader context. They are no longer the dominant narrative. They are part of a growing record. The papers do not declare him guilty. They do not declare him innocent. They let his denial stand, for now. Coverage of Captain Edward J. Smith remains unchanged. The heroic framing holds. He is described as remaining on the bridge, maintaining order, and going down with his ship. There is still no public questioning of his judgment, no linking of speed to his decisions. That debate remains abstract and general, not yet attached to him personally. Friday's papers also mark the quiet return of sports to the front page. Baseball schedules appear, game results are printed. They are smaller than the Titanic headlines, but they are present. This is not indifference, it is normalization. Life resumes its rhythms even as morning continues. Friday's papers also carry another disaster, unrelated to the Titanic, yet impossible to ignore. A flood reported under the stark headline, 200 Lives Lost, appears elsewhere on the page. The item likely refers to a river flood affecting low-lying river bottoms and rural communities. The reports suggest widespread agricultural damage, submerged homes, and a high casualty count. There are few details. No portraits accompany the story. Little follow-up is offered in the days that follow. Yet its placement matters. Printed beside maritime loss and national inquiry, the flood reminds readers that catastrophe is not singular. That disaster, whether by sea or river, continues beyond the frame of one great tragedy. In one of the final papers of the week, a brief item in a lower column reports that Hillman has been arrested. The notice offers little detail and no explanation of charge or duration, appearing as routine news amid the week's larger headlines. It is presented without emphasis, the kind of item that would normally pass quickly through the reader's eye, now sharing space with stories of national consequence. Nearby, notices of the Oregon primary election also appear. Even during a week dominated by disaster, election reporting continues. The item is short, factual, and procedural, offering no commentary or reflection. Its presence is quiet but deliberate, a reminder that civic processes carry on, that ballots are still cast. A Saturday, April 20. By Saturday, the week begins to settle. Not because the loss has lightened, but because the shock has passed. Saturday's papers feel different, not lighter. Steadier, the catastrophe is no longer breaking news. It is now a known disaster, even if the details remain fluid. Death counts are printed with more confidence, though they still vary by paper. Some list 1,410 dead. Others report more than 1,500 lost. Few attempt to explain the discrepancy. By now, readers are accustomed to unstable numbers. Saturday's headlines shift toward process. The official inquiry takes center stage. White Star Line officials are questioned again. They are described as cautious, sometimes evasive. The tone toward them is no longer neutral, but it is not yet hostile. The Senate proceedings are framed as orderly, methodical, and serious. This is governance responding to catastrophe. At the same time, Saturday's papers make clear that the Titanic has not erased other concerns. Political developments continue. In Illinois, Democratic politics are described as violent and disorderly. Elsewhere, conventions are disrupted by strikes. Labor unrest appears repeatedly, woven into the news cycle. Municipal reform stories run alongside disaster. Coverage. One paper describes a proposal to introduce auto trucks for a free garbage system, framed as progress and efficiency rather than extravagance. Agricultural news appears as well. Children are enlisted to fight a fruit fly infestation, presented as civic duty. Immigration remains visible. Immigrants are released under large bonds. Courts hand down sentences. Authority asserts itself daily. Saturday's papers also include international developments. British financial interests are reported developing property on Fanning Island. Naval movements in the Pacific are mentioned again. A submarine flotilla is discussed, requested, repositioned, debated. While the nation remains transfixed by the Titanic disaster, quieter shifts of power are taking place at home. That week, newspapers report the appointment of a new federal revenue collector, a position that controls tax enforcement and the flow of government money. In 1912, these appointments are not routine. They reflect political loyalty, patronage, and trust, at a moment when the federal government is preparing to expand its reach. To readers at the time, this signals who is gaining influence and who is losing it, as Washington tightens its grip on national finances. That same week, far from the North Atlantic, another shock ripples through American politics. Former President Theodore Roosevelt wins the Oregon primary, a state that allows voters, not party bosses, to decide. His victory is seen as a direct challenge to the Republican establishment and proof that his progressive message still carries force. Nationally, the result deepens fears of a fractured party and signals that the 1912 election will not follow old rules. To many readers, it feels as though the country itself is pushing back against entrenched power. None of these stories are linked to the Titanic. They are reminders that the machinery of the world continues to turn, and that democracy proceeds even as tragedy commands the front page. As the narrative steadies, two names rise with particular weight. Archibald Butt, John Jacob Astor IV. Major Archibald Butt was a senior military officer and a trusted aide to President William Howard Taft, a familiar figure in Washington and a man known for discipline, loyalty, and public service. He had been returning from Europe aboard the Titanic after a period of rest, and his presence on the ship was widely noted in the press. To readers in 1912, Butt was not just another passenger. He represented the federal government itself, a symbol of order and duty, traveling abroad under the American flag. John Jacob Astor IV, by contrast, represented wealth on a global scale. He was one of the richest men in the world, an heir to the Astor fortune, traveling first class with his young wife. His name alone carried immense social weight. Newspapers assumed their readers knew him, not as a stranger, but as a fixture of American power, industry, and privilege. What the papers emphasized was not simply that these men died, but how they were said to have faced death. Reports described them walking the decks calmly, assisting women and other passengers, and refusing opportunities to save themselves. Their behavior was framed not merely as personal choice, but as character, as an ideal of masculine restraint and public honor. In print, they became symbols, men of status who did not demand exemption, figures whose composure stood in contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. In the telling of the newspapers, their deaths were not sensationalized. They were steadied, almost ceremonial, offered to readers as examples of how authority, wealth, and responsibility were expected to behave when the world, quite literally, was going under. The tone of reporting is highly romanticized. It emphasizes dignity, sacrifice, masculinity, a class-based ideal of heroism. This is where words like dreamlike and unreal begin to appear, not to describe the sinking itself, but the behavior of those who did not survive. One line attributed to Astor, appears repeatedly. "I'll meet you in New York." Papers report that Astor's last words were said to be this, often printed without verification, offered less as confirmed fact than as comfort. The line reassures readers that calm prevailed, that separation was temporary, that death arrived with grace. By Saturday, this kind of framing becomes more common. Praise of the crew and passengers begins to appear in earnest. Some papers on Saturday, others continuing into Sunday, April 21st. This timing matters. By now, survivor lists are more stable. Panic rumors are being corrected. The focus shifts from what happened to how people behaved. This is when the papers begin to moralize the disaster. Survivors speak highly of the crew, certain. Phrases repeat again and again: calm, orderly, disciplined, no panic. These accounts are presented as survivor testimony, not universal truth, but they shape the narrative all the same. By Saturday, the Titanic is no longer only a tragedy to be explained. It is a story being organized, interpreted, and slowly, deliberately given meaning. Sunday, April 21st, 1912. By Sunday morning, April 21st, nearly a full week has passed since the Titanic went down. The newspapers no longer shout. There are no extras rushing from the presses. The language has changed. Across the country, Sunday editions carry a similar notice, printed plainly and without ornament. Services on Sunday in all the churches. By common consent, pulpits across the nation are set aside for prayer and remembrance. Regular sermons are postponed. The disaster is no longer framed as breaking news, but as settled loss. The papers describe this day not as one of urgency or alarm, but as a day of sorrow. In these Sunday columns, the Titanic is presented as a tragedy without precedent, not only in scale, but in meaning. Writers speak of courage rather than confusion, of restraint rather than panic. Survivors' accounts are summarized carefully, emphasizing calm behavior, orderly evacuation, and the conduct of the crew. Passengers of every class are mentioned together now. Steerage, second, first. Described not by wealth or position, but by their actions in the final hours. The language flattens distinctions. In death, the newspapers suggest, all stood equal. The familiar reference to music aboard the ship appears again, briefly, almost ritualistically. Hymns are mentioned not as verified detail, but as part of a growing narrative of composure and dignity. By Sunday, the music is less a fact to be proven than a symbol the public has already accepted. Numbers are printed with greater confidence. The count of survivors is fixed. The count of the dead is still described as uncertain, but no longer disputed. The tone is no longer anxious. It is final. At the same time, Sunday marks a turning point. By Sunday morning, the Titanic disaster has moved beyond shock and into scrutiny. Newspapers report that the Senate inquiry is resuming, and that key witnesses are being called back to testify, not to recount heroism, but to answer for decisions made before and after the collision. Among the most anticipated witnesses is Madeline Astor, widow of John Jacob Astor. The paper notes that Mrs. Astor is prepared to testify when hearings reopen, her survival standing in quiet contrast to her husband's death. Her appearance carries symbolic weight. She represents first-class passage, privilege, and visibility, and her testimony is expected to shed light on how the evacuation unfolded for those at the very top of the ship's social order. Another account comes from Jack Thayer, a young first-class passenger and the son of a prominent railroad executive. The paper describes how Thayer escaped the sinking ship by jumping into the sea as Titanic went under. He struggles in the freezing water, clings to wreckage, and is eventually pulled to safety by crew members. His testimony offers readers a vivid glimpse into the final moments, not from a lifeboat, but from the water itself. While the article identifies his father as a powerful business figure, it focuses on Jack's personal ordeal rather than family status or outcome. Testimony also continues from Titanic's wireless operators. One operator describes the frantic effort to send distress calls, the constant signaling, and the attempt to reach nearby vessels. The paper frames this testimony as part of a growing debate, not over whether help was summoned, but whether it arrived in time. By Sunday, the question is no longer about effort alone, but about judgment, procedure, and delay. Though the article does not spell it out directly, the witness coverage reflects the structure of the ship itself. Titanic carried first-class, second-class, and third-class passengers, along with its crew, each group experiencing the disaster differently. The Sunday paper's emphasis on prominent survivors quietly reveals how class shaped which stories reached the public first, and whose voices were now being called into official record. Away from the hearings, Americans are reminded that uncertainty is not confined to the North Atlantic. The paper reports that authorities still have no definite clue in the robbery of more than $14,000 from the Globe Express Company. The money has vanished. Suspects have been arrested, but not identified. Investigators admit the trail has gone cold, even as senators demand accountability from ship owners and officers. Readers are confronting crime at home that offers no clear answers and no easy resolution. Political unrest fills the same columns. After a strong showing in Oregon earlier in the week, former President Theodore Roosevelt gains further momentum, with reports declaring West Virginia for Roosevelt. The result is treated as more than a local contest. It signals a growing revolt against party leadership and confirms fears that the Republican Party is splitting apart. Editors frame the victory as evidence that voters are rejecting old structures and demanding reform, a theme that echoes loudly in a nation already questioning authority in the wake of disaster. And finally, the Sunday paper returns readers to the local courts. One report describes a fatal quarrel that begins over something trivial, a pair of cuff buttons, and ends in sudden death. The victim is unarmed. The accused is taken into custody almost immediately. The article lingers on the senselessness of the act, a stark reminder that everyday violence continues, even as the nation's attention remains fixed on a tragedy at sea. As I read through these papers, I'll admit I was briefly confused by the repeated references to President Roosevelt. I've always known Theodore Roosevelt as the 26th President of the United States, who served from 1901 to 1909. So seeing his name dominate political headlines in 1912 gave me pause. But as I read more closely, these articles reveal something I hadn't expected to learn. That although he had already served 2 terms as president, Roosevelt was once again actively seeking the Republican nomination, challenging his party's leadership from within. It is only later, after failing to secure that nomination, that he will break away and run as a third-party candidate. Reading the newspapers in real time makes it clear just how unsettled the race still was in April of 1912. By Sunday, April 21st, Americans are not only mourning, they are questioning. from Senate chambers to courtrooms, from political primaries to unresolved robberies. The headlines reveal a country uneasy with explanations, impatient with authority, and searching for accountability, on land as much as on the ocean. One paper notes that much of the full story is still unknown, that many days, perhaps years, will pass before the world fully comprehends what happened in mid-ocean. But the week itself has reached its end. There are no new rescues expected, no new ships approaching the wreck site, no remaining hope that alters the outcome. The newspapers fold the Titanic into memory. What began as confusion on Monday, surged into shock by Tuesday, hardened into testimony by the weekend, now settles into reflection. The country pauses, not to ask what happens next, but to consider what has already been lost. And with that, the week closes. Throughout this week, the newspapers do not always agree. Names appear and disappear. Events are reported before they are seen. Some headlines prove accurate, others do not. This is not an error of memory. It is the nature of news as it unfolded in 1912. Information traveled by wire, not by certainty. What readers received each day was incomplete, emotional, and in motion. If you've listened all the way to the end, we hope you'll support the channel by subscribing and tapping the like button. Thank you for being here.